What up, though? Dwayne Barnes, MPA, here for week 8 of 10, AAS 477, Power and Protest, the Civil Rights Movement from 1960, let's say 1955, that's where we started, to 1968, or 1955 to 1968. Week 8 of 10, man, we getting there. We almost there. It's crazy that we're already this far as we've come along. Now you know who this is. You know what we do. This ain't the beginning of the class, but Dwayne Barnes, MPA. I started this class in February, actually, when we did the Jim Crow class. Did 5 sessions of economics and Jim Crow, looking at the time from right after slavery, Reconstruction, all the way to 1954, where we called that the Jim Crow era. And then we picked up in this class 8 weeks ago now, when we started looking at Emmett Till and his lynching, and then Brown v. Board of Education. I'm sorry, and then the Montgomery bus boycott. Now we've traveled through the years and we've gone through all the movements within this, well, not all the movements we chose to follow within the civil rights movement. And now we're here at week 8. And week 8 is our conversation around, I call it Up South. That was a term that was coined by those who went up north and found that the North was not where the streets was paved with gold like we thought, when Chicago and LA and Detroit, but it was Up South. If you've seen the movie Sinners, one of the characters said Chicago just like Mississippi, but with skyscrapers. So that kind of sentiment. So we'll be looking at the civil rights movement outside of the South, focusing on MLK in Chicago and the Chicago Freedom Movement and the uprisings in Watts, 1965, and in Detroit, 1967. We mentioned, I'm moving way too fast. Let me take a step back. So I'm here an hour earlier today. We're usually on at 3 p.m., but seeing as, we're on a holiday weekend, I figured, why not give me and my family a little more time to get on that grill and not have to eat so late. And I just couldn't wait to get to the information today. So I sent something out probably about an hour and a half ago about we're going to meet at 2 o'clock today. So now we're on a little bit earlier today. Let me just give you a little bit of context on the course, and we can move forward here. I'm going to share my screen so you can see. I always love to share the information that I have just about some of the goals and some of the objectives of the course here. So here we go. Objectives are to critically analyze the strategies, tactics, and philosophies employed by the civil rights movement. 2, understand the historical context of segregation and the discrimination in the United States. 3, examine the roles and key figures and the organizations within the movement. 4, right here, to explore the complexities of social change and the challenges faced by the activists. And then finally, foster critical thinking and discussion around the legacy of the civil rights movement. So let's do a quick recap of last week, week 7. So week 7 was a really good week as far as the content and where we are in the movement. Like I said, we started at 55. Last week we were at 66. So we're over 10 years in at that moment. We took a step back to look at the transition. The last 2 weeks have been about the transition from traditional civil rights, direct, nonviolent action. And then my broken clock, that's right, about 2 times a day. It's always over my shoulder, trying to get it off my shoulder. And we talked about the thought leadership of Malcolm X and how his perspectives and his philosophy was really starting to go into the cities and to the SNCC and CORE and the younger organizations, and really starting to hold its force. We talked about the Louds County Democratic, the Louds County Freedom Organization, which is this logo right here, which was the same image that the Panthers used for the Black Panther Party, which we'll be talking a lot about next week. And then we talked about the James Meredith March Against Fear. All of this was Malcolm got assassinated in 1965. Louds County and the March Against Fear were all in 1966. And then we're still in 66 to 68 this week. So, the March Against Fear, we're going to intersect that with a little bit of our talk about Chicago, because it happened during that same time when Dr. King went to Chicago. So we're looking at a movement now that's less of what it was, as far as, the we shall overcome, and now starting to get to, hey man, We tired, we sick of it, and we want power, and we want the power to determine how our politics, our community, and our economics are run. We talked about Stokely Carmichael and his contributions last week as well. And we really started to set this picture up of how we're transitioning, or how the movement was transitioning into more of a Black power motif. Okay, let's hide this one and let's get this one going. So we're setting the stage. So civil rights outside of the South. We've put a lot of our emphasis during this class on what was going on down South, in Birmingham, in Jackson, Mississippi, in uh, where were the freedom rides? North Carolina, South Carolina, uh, Mississippi, Texas, all of these places down south where you see Jim Crow supposedly the hardest. But in the last couple of weeks, we've been looking at, the North was a tough place as well. Places like Chicago, places like New York, places like Pittsburgh or Philly. We'll look out west in Los Angeles. These entities and these cities were, well, let's take a step back. In the first class, we talked about how the Great Migration led to hundreds of thousands of African Americans leaving the South, going north, northeast, and west, landing in Chicago, in New York, in Oklahoma, in New Orleans, or in New Orleans to California, to Washington, to Oregon for the defense industry. We also talked about kind of what happened when some of those industries started to dry up. So now we're in a time where in Chicago, in Detroit, in Los Angeles, you have an overflow of African Americans looking for jobs and economic opportunities and political opportunities, and to just be a part of society. And now you have a change. You're seeing, well, what we thought was a Southern thing is starting to pop its head up in the North. There's two kind of racisms or segregations: de facto by fact, or de jure by knowledge. And so now we're getting away from, get out of here, you're in and you're down south, to more of, not to cross these lines. You're not going, we're going to red line you up out of here. You're not going to get it, those kind of things. And then we look at places like Detroit, manufacturing capital. You have this dynamic between labor and workers, more redlining. So we're starting to see a case where we're looking to two things. One, Dr. King and his contingents are looking to test, can this direct nonviolent action work in the North, when he chose to go to Chicago? And then you have another dynamic of, people, and we talked about last week how the movement was starting to blossom into not being just for church folks, not just being for college kids, but being for the average everyday citizen. And at this time, when you put unemployment, terrible housing, not really good education outcomes together, and you thought these laws were supposed to change, equal opportunity laws with the Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, and the Brown versus Board, which desegregated schools, you're starting to see some of the stuff ain't really making a change. That's that's what people were feeling at the time. So now you have all these elements coming together, and that places us into a situation where we drop right in on Watts. So the Watts situation wasn't just some kind of random action of just saying one night people in hoodlums got, crazy and nuts and they started this thing. Nah, that wasn't it. Many of the issues that I mentioned earlier were in play in Watts. So you're talking about people coming to Los Angeles through the Great Migration. I believe it was over in 25 years. I believe it was 250,000 people, maybe 300,000 people made their way to LA. And so over that time, there was always an issue, especially after the war industries were done, what were going to happen. So you started to see a lot of redlining we talked about in class one. Even, stars like Hattie McDaniel was taking cases in front of the courts to find a place to be able to live in a good neighborhood. And she was a, Hollywood actress. And so imagine for your average everyday people. But also at the same time, you did have people who were able to kind of normalize themselves and find themselves into a decent position and some really good positions out there. Doctors, lawyers, people who went to university, people who were able to, blue collar people who were able to really find really good jobs and build a family out there, people who own homes, people who had a profession, people whose kids were going to college. So I don't want to make it seem like, everybody was having a tough time. Just like now, our community isn't a monolith. So you had people who were made their way to some really good outcomes, professional level and even further. And then you also had people who were, your typical kind of middle class folks who owned a home and had a job and kids went forward. But then you had a lot of people who were left out of a lot of those opportunities. So you still have situations where there was, homelessness or really tough living conditions, lack of economic opportunities, a job to feed your family. LA was very unique because, and we'll talk about this later as we go, they didn't have a local war on poverty plan and funding. So other cities, and I'll get into that later, but just make a long story short, they had their social safety nets weren't as wide or deep as they needed to be to help this new population that they had. And so this time in so there were things baked into the Watts riot. So you got over 25 years, 250,000 people, or 300,000 people come to LA. In the early 60s, you had a situation where there was a fight in a Elijah Muhammad mosque between the nation or between some black folks and the police. And a black man was killed, 4 were shot, and no action taken against the cops. That's going to be another part of this conversation: police brutality and the relationship between the residents and the police. In 1964, you had a situation where the Catholic Church was trying to come to an end to understand how to handle this, where one half was saying, or one cardinal was saying, well, hey, this is a moral issue and we should be taking this up the same way we take up everything else, kind of the Dr. King in the perspective. And one saying, no, it's a political issue. We're not dealing with that. And so you're seeing a fraction even in between the parishioners and saying, where's it going to go here? And then 1964, the political year, housing was under attack. So there was because of the Hattie McDaniel situation, there was a law on the book saying anybody with the right amount of money and can afford it can live wherever they want to. Well, that was flipped. There was a referendum on that. So it was flipped. So you have police brutality. You have questions about where you can and can't live. You have these very tough conditions for those looking for economic opportunities, all boiling up. And this resentment between the people who live there, the people who migrated there, and the authorities there to watch them, and even the political. So you're having this thing kind of boil up over the years where tensions are growing. But on the outside, those who can't see the community for what it is, they're thinking everything is fine. Same way they would do in Jackson, same way they would do in Montgomery. No, our Negroes are fine. They're, they do what they do, and they're going to be just fine. And that wasn't the case. So let's paint a more interesting picture of Watts as well. So, Watts wasn't a slum, like I mentioned earlier. It wasn't a ghetto, but it was a slum, or it was a ghetto, but not a slum. Saying that there are economic, opportunities there. 2/3 of the adults had less than a high school education. 1 in 8, they said, was illiterate. 9 out of the 10 homes were built in 1939. So we're talking about the 60s at this point. They had half of the median income of their white counterparts in the city. Over 60% of Watts families received some kind of welfare. Remember, we talking about they wanted economic opportunities. They didn't come here. They didn't come out west to do that. They wanted jobs. They wanted to have opportunities. They said 1 in 3 teens came from broken homes. Dropout rate of 2x more than the city as a whole. And let me take a step back. Watts is a neighborhood or a section of the wider Los Angeles area. And let's see. So now you have the situation where people who are coming looking for economic opportunity aren't finding them. And you know what happens when you can't find economic opportunities? You go to the black market, you go to the streets, you go to the other places, to where I left Mississippi because I wanted opportunities. Now I'm here and I can't find them. What am I going to do? And so, to make a long story short on how this thing started, I look at it as the spark. It happened when a young man, Marquette Fry, was pulled over for intoxication on 116th and Avalon in the city of Los Angeles, the neighborhood of Watts, for reckless driving by these officers. I mentioned earlier it was a problem between the officers and the community. And so his mother came out, because this is a community. Mother came out to see what the heck was going on. As the cops pulled them out the car, Mama jumped on the officer's back or got into some kind of, altercation situation. And they said that the cops shoved another pregnant woman. So as this is happening, residents are coming out of their homes and they're seeing what's going on. And of course, they're not going to be on the side of the cops. So to make a long story short, 6 cars rolled up and you had over 500 people out there. And basically the neighborhood blew up. So there's so much more nuance. And so let me take a step back and do that. I was going to jump right into the. So there was some nuance. So this is on a Wednesday night. We're talking about 5 days of rioting, looting, setting fires, beating people down, escalations between cops and residents, and it's looking like a war-torn place, kind of like just looking bad. And so you have a situation where things really exploded. And at the time, there's an issue between the governor and the mayor. So the mayor is out on a speaking tour, just kind of doing his mayorly duties. You have the governor who was gone on vacation doing his normal thing that he does. And so you have the police chief there to deal with a lot of what was going on. And so let's just take a quick rundown of what happened during those days. So Wednesday, August 11th, that's when the police traffic stop happened. And that's the first day of the looting. So again, we talked about, so you're going to see a theme here. There was looting. So you're walking up in the store, getting what you need up out of there, and setting it on fire. You're taking cars, you pulling people out who may have gave you a problem. You flipping the car over, setting it on fire. You're sick and tired. You're mad. You are fit to be tied. I don't believe it was just a criminal element of these gangsters and criminals are tearing up our city. No, that wasn't it. I was looking for a job. I couldn't find one. I went to the store to get a deal. They wouldn't give me one. I went in here to buy something. They treated me like trash. I tried to, and I'm just sick and I'm tired. Half the contingent. And then maybe it was some, the younger ones that maybe just was, along for the ride. But this was people's only way to talk about their disdain or show their disdain for the way they've been treated in this community. Thursday the 12th, the now you left just that little corner or neighborhood and it spread throughout the entire city. Buildings were being looted, buildings were being robbed, looting of the stores, clashes between police and the protesters, and the powers that be, the government, are having a tough time making a decision on how to handle things. So the local police department are just deploying those who are supposed to be in that area. And like I said, it was, hundreds of thousands of people moved to LA, and since it was overcrowded, it was a ton of people. So they were having their hands full trying to deal with it. Friday and Saturday, the 13th and the 15th, is when the violence continued unabated. The police was crashing with the mobs. Firefighters were getting hit with rocks and pushed aside. The National Guard wasn't deployed yet. There was a conversation between the governor and the mayor to see how they wanted to handle it. And, nobody wanted to be the city where you needed to have this happen. We've seen it happen down south. But they didn't want to see this stuff happen. So they're trying to think we can wrangle this thing together. And during that time, they weren't. And things were getting burned. People were getting hurt. Looting was ensuing. The cops was trying to arrest folks. Just all kind of craziness happening. What we would consider like the end of the world kind of thing. Fires burning and people, doing all they can. They say they said Friday is when it reached its peak. Until the authorities were able to get the National Guard deployed. So Saturday the 16th, the riot subsided. A curfew was issued and the National Guard was there. So you have 14,000 soldiers there to kind of quell this fight that's going on. And on the 17th, that Monday, so almost a week later, 6 days into the violence, the city started seeing some normalcy. And we were kind of that's kind of where we were. So let's put some stats to what was going on. So we're talking about in total over 34 deaths, over 1,000 injuries, they estimated $200 million in property damage. And then you had to kind of deal with its aftermath. So after the situation between the government trying to get their strategy correct, the police department trying to get their strategy correct, and the National Guard coming in and, more or less ending the situation after people was kind of done. Okay, we set the fires, and I'm saying this tongue in cheek, but I mean it as well. We set the fires, we looted the buildings, we got what we needed. The anger has quelled to a certain extent. So a lot of what was going on, and I'll echo this because then we saw it again in LA in 1992, and we'll see it again in Detroit in 67 and some of these other ones. So let me save that. That's for the riot, the Black Power class after this one. And so now you get a situation where people are finally ready to talk and listen and hear about, one, how did it happen? Two, why did it happen? And how can we solve this problem? So the local government blamed the Black leaders. You guys can't control them. You don't know. You said you were their leaders and we couldn't stop them. And all these days, you couldn't get them going. And the leaders and other people are like, no, these conditions are the reason why people was doing this. Straight up. And so you had Dr. King come out there. They rebuffed that. No, we ain't doing this now. Remember, I told you tides was turning. No, we ain't doing that nonviolent, and we might go up again. Yeah, you stopped us now, but we still not happy with what we still need what we need. And the call was for jobs, opportunities. It wasn't just we want to be here being riotous for a living. No, we want a way to have a future. And that's what they were trying to get across. Dick Gregory came out there, of civil rights fame. And they rebuffed him too. Nah, we don't need you. We don't want you doing that either. Local congressmen tried to come. City council folks tried to come. Nah, we don't want that either. The brothers and the sisters was tired. They just were tired. And and that's why it happened the way it did. Let's see what we got here. So the governor put together what they called the Macomb Commission. And the Macomb Commission or Macomb report, similar to the Kerner Commission, which we'll talk about later, was an analysis of what happened during that riot, what were some of the causes, and how can this be averted in the future, and how can we kind of figure out what's going on. And to make a long story short, it pulled out some of the information we were talking about. People are underworked, they are underhoused, they're undereducated. How are we going to handle this? And the LA County was saying, well, look, it's not our problem per se. We got a problem with the feds. The feds haven't given us the money we needed for our war on poverty funds. And the feds came back like, well, look, every other city that we deal with, they have their own pot of money for poverty programs. And then we come through and we supplement that. And so fingers are going back and forth. All this stuff is happening. And they get down to the bottom of it. A reporter a gentleman who was a messenger during the riots, would-be reporter. So he started covering it and figuring out what was going on, Mr. Robert Richardson. And he said, well, listen, police brutality happens a lot of different ways. It's not just through knocking somebody's heads off. It's when I'm out with my woman and you pull me and you throw me against the wall and you pat me down and ask me where I'm going and try to take my manhood away from me. It's the language you use. Hey, you in, hey, you that, hey, you this. It's the procedures you use. Get on the car, slam you on the car, check you down, in addition to some of the other things. So we're saying we got a problem around here around police brutality. And it also, it was another force, was a resentment between the classes. So I'm one of those talented 10th individuals who became a lawyer and I want to move out into a neighborhood. Well, they don't want me living there. So now they go further out. Or you got these people who we call immigrants or migrants from the South coming into lower class neighborhoods. And because you don't want to live next to nobody who got a different skin color, you got a resentment towards them for coming up. Sounded like what we're dealing with today. So you got this class struggle. You have this economic struggle. You got police trying to use their force to ensure that this situation goes the way they want it to. And so you had a powder keg. It was also a national study called the Study of 21 Million Negroes in America. Daniel Mariah, he was the Secretary of Labor, and he laid out a very interesting case of why the American Negro is feeling the way they're feeling and doing what they're doing. It was used for good and for bad, but we understand that, it was basically saying, to my interpretation, America just wasn't investing in its people the way it should. And that's why you're starting to see the call from civil rights to, just give us equality and give us this and give us that. And we're going to stand firm for it. And we're going to do what we got to do to tie it. You know what I'm saying? And we're going to set this bitch up. Burn, baby, burn. You know what I'm saying? UCLA produced a study that did a demographic profile on the riot as well. Now, of course, anytime you have these government studies and academic studies, it was a scene in Malcolm X, and I keep going back to that movie because we just celebrated his 100th birthday, and I think it being the movie that it was really a lesson that I teach my son to this day. When Malcolm X got into jail, he was ready to finally start to kind of think another way. Brother Baines, the character, set him down and had him reading through the dictionary, and he said, showed him what black was in there and what white was. And he was like, well, look, you got to read between the lines here. So when these studies come out, you got to read between the lines. So they saying, the average demographic profile for a rioter was a 17-year-old boy, college dropout, come from a fatherless home with a family monthly income less than $300. And so we're talking about undereducation, poverty programs, economic opportunities for that family. Those were the ingredients that made this made people feel like this was the only option they had, is to loot and to burn and to show their anger and their frustration in that way. You also had Vietnam. You also had, and we had this class. I kind of did it this way on purpose. We kind of was talking about only one side of the story. In my Jim Crow class, we talked about U.S. history and Black history and all history as it related to one another. This one, I wanted to spend more time just on the civil rights portion. So I hadn't mentioned that in '63, Vietnam started, and we were sending our troops to Vietnam, and they were predominantly sent to the front lines, young Black brothers. And we'll get into Ali in the next class about how that started to be a problem. So you had Vietnam, lack of education, lack of economic opportunities. So what we got out of riots was one, Pac said it in the song "To Live and Die in LA." We might fight amongst each other, but I promise you this: we'll burn this bitch down. You get us pissed. And that was tongue in cheek of saying, when you devoid people of economic, political, social opportunities, ways to go from one class to the next, way to go from being on welfare to a job to a owner, the way from going from being in a job to an owner, from going from the ghetto to the neighborhood you want to live in. When you deprive those opportunities to people over time, they have to have a way to talk about it. And even Dr. King himself said, riots are the voice of the unheard. Let's see, was anything else I missed here between cops, let me take a quick look to make sure I didn't miss anything. So a lot more lives lost, more catastrophe, calamity. And then also this is changing civil rights. So when it was "We Shall Overcome" and the Black folks getting their heads knocked off, it gained a lot of support. But when you start to say we want Black power, and you start to burn buildings down and loot and show your anger, that starts to curb some of the appetite for civil rights. So those who were maybe in favor of saying, I'll go march with Dr. King, or I was there with him and I believe this should happen, now they're starting to change their stance a little bit. So now you're starting to see even the wider community changing their stance on what Black power is, how these people are doing this in our great cities in America. So you're really starting to get to this, and we'll get to it when we get to the 70s, this really big pull between, what's going on in this country. See, any final words on Watts before I move us past it? Watts at the time was the largest and most expensive and most deadly urban riot. This wasn't in the South. Harlem had one in '64. Chicago had one in '66, where the Puerto Rican brothers and sisters, I hope we can still call them brothers and sisters, were fighting over police brutality as well. But Watts kind of set the standard. But as you'll see in good old Detroit, we up the stakes. So that's all about Watts. Make a long story short, gentleman was pulled over. The residents got sick and tired of it, and a riot ensued. Lots of damage, lots of looting, lots of fire. After it was over, everybody was trying to figure out why. Eventually, the poverty program did get into play. Also, if you've seen Menace to Society, if you was from the '90s and you watched the movie Menace to Society, they touch on what happened in Watts just briefly, but they talk about Watts. So that movie took place in Watts, and how it later further investment wasn't there. And you saw in 1992, after the Rodney King case, LA went up again in smoke. So, that's kind of what happened with Watts. It was a situation where Black power and Black power. So let me get this right, because I'm saying this to be nuanced. I'm saying this and I need more nuance to it. Black power wasn't burn the city down, burn your building down. It was economic self-determination, political self-determination, and social self-determination. But at that time, people didn't feel like they had those things. So they were using the tools of a riot to show the only power that they have. I kind of think about it like this, and I'm not calling these people that. This is an example. When somebody is trying to tell you something that they want or what they need, and you don't listen, and they throw a temper tantrum. These people weren't throwing a temper tantrum, but I'm likening it to a temper tantrum in that I tried it every other way. I tried to talk to you. I tried to reason with you. I tried all these things. Now I'm going to show my anger and my frustration this way. And then when you finally calm down from that temper tantrum, it's like, okay, I'm sorry, but that was my only way of showing it to you. So, when I think about the riot, because the other side of it is, and we'll talk about this more as we move forward in the next class. Even in Detroit, one thing that they did, they didn't burn down the Soul Brothers. They didn't burn down the Brothers. Now we walked into Mr. Eddie's barbershop. That's where we go. I ain't burning that down. We ain't looting that. You know what I'm saying? We going to that other spot where when we walked in, they looked at us different, or called us this, or gave me a bad deal, or did these things. So we still had an idea around, our culture and how we wanted to navigate it. But, people was mad and they was tired. So that's one example out west. So this not talking about down south. We're talking about out west. So this brings us to, well, no, before I do that, let me show this video. I almost had us running. I almost forgot. So let's take what I just talked about and let's put it in more context. I'm going to bring up a video, how we do, to kind of bring put the final bow on what happened in Watts, fill in some of the details, and provide a little more context. So let me share my screen and we'll be ready to talk more about Watts, and then we'll move on to Dr. King in Chicago. Watts, here we go.
On August 11th, 1965, 21-year-old Marquette Fry and his brother were pulled over on 116th Street and Avalon Boulevard in the Watts neighborhood of Los Angeles for alleged reckless driving. A crowd began to gather as Fry failed sobriety tests and police attempted to tow his car. Marquette's mother, Rena Fry, emerged from the crowd to find her son resisting arrest and one of the California Highway Patrol officers withdrawing his firearm, to which Miss Fry jumped onto the officer's back without hesitation, causing the crowd to begin cheering. As CHP officers arrested all three of the Frys, the surrounding crowd became enraged by the family's arrest and began protesting as the police cars drove away. The chaos that followed left 34 people dead, including 23 killed by police or National Guard, as well as over 1,000 people injured, at least 600 buildings damaged from fires or looting, another 200 buildings completely destroyed with property damage topping $200 million, and around 3,500 people being arrested over a 6-day period. The Watts riots in August 1965 were among the bloodiest, costliest, and most analyzed uprisings of the notoriously unsettled mid-1960s. Although the riot began in August 1965, the tensions within the city date back at least 2 decades. Following World War II, over 500,000 African Americans migrated to West Coast cities in hopes of escaping racism and discrimination. However, they inevitably found both on the West Side as well. For many Black LA residents who lived in Watts, their isolation within the community proved that racial equality remained a distant aspiration as they experienced the same housing, education, employment, and political discrimination as Blacks did across the country. 2 years leading up to the Watts riots, 65 Black people were shot by police. 27 of them were shot in the back, and 25 of them were unarmed. During this period in LA, there were 250 demonstrations against living conditions and police brutality. These racial injustices caused Watts' African American population to explode on August 11, 1965, and what would become the Watts Rebellion. The morning after the first night of the riots, community leaders held a meeting that included representatives from churches, local government, and the NAACP. Rena also attended and asked for peace and calm from local citizens. She, Marquette, and Ronald had all been released on bail earlier that morning. Immediately following Rena's statement, a teenager grabbed the microphone and told the crowd that rioters planned to move into the white sections of Los Angeles. Now, that prompted Los Angeles Police Department Chief William H. Parker to call on the National Guard, despite local leaders requesting the police dispatch more black officers instead. By the end of the third day, rioting covered a 50 square mile section of Los Angeles, and 14,000 National Guard troops were dispatched to the city. Police Commissioner Parker reportedly called rioters monkeys in a zoo and implied that Muslims were infiltrating and agitating the violence. In the early morning of the final day of the riots, police commenced a shootout outside of a mosque, arrested the worshippers inside, then ransacked the building next door and tear gassed the sewers to prevent anyone from escaping. Fires destroyed the mosque, and the Muslim community accused police of using the riots as an excuse to destroy their place of worship. Most of the 34 dead from the riot were black citizens. 2 policemen and 1 firefighter were among the casualties, and 26 deaths, the result of LAPD or National Guardsmen, were deemed justifiable homicides. There was little follow up, but a new era of local activism emerged in Watts. Reformed street gang members who joined with the Black Panther Party to rebuild and monitor police interactions with citizens in the community. Marquette Frye was haunted mentally and physically following the 1965 riots that many naysayers have placed on his shoulders. He was under police and federal authority surveillance and was arrested for a variety of crimes over years afterward. Marquette remained part of the community and adamantly warned children and young adults of the dangers of drinking, drugs, and gangs. He passed away from pneumonia on Christmas Eve, 1986, at the age of 42. And if you didn't know, now you know.
And so, this would be one of the final things I say on Watts. That was so beautifully done, and I'll drop the link to this in our wrap up. So we wondered how the Panthers, how the nation, which really organized around our people, we wonder how the Panthers came in and made such an impact. Police brutality was their number one issue early when they started, and you have all these cities around the country that went up in flames, especially after Dr. King's death. It was easy to connect SNCC. Remember the Student Nonviolent Coordination Committee, who started to turn students more to the more of a radical revolutionary Black Power perspective. You had not random. Let me stop that. You had everyday citizens in the Black community who weren't a part of those elite classes looking to protect it and serve in their community. So as we look at the Panthers next week a bit, and in the next class, the Black Power class, you'll see how that style of organizing really galvanized our communities and really made them feel, welcome. I also want to say this because I got to. If you're on the YouTube page, like and share that thing. Especially drop me a like, drop something in the comment. Let me know you're here with me. Like it and share it so we can grow the growth of it. We can grow the movement, especially as we'll be heading to our next class. And I'll talk about that at the end of the class today. So that is Watts in a nutshell. Let's take a quick little spin to Dr. King and his plight in Chicago. So let's catch up on our good brother, Dr. King. So last time we talked about Dr. King, we talked about him every week. It was in the March Against Fear that James Meredith was leading in 1966, a march from Memphis to Jackson, Mississippi. This was the march where he got shot second day in. So everybody else, CORE, NACP, SCLC, SNCC came to finish the march, and every other revolutionary finished the march. That's where we started to see Stokely Carmichael when he dropped in Greenwood, Mississippi, the call for Black Power. And we saw Dr. King saying, you know what? Well, I'm still with what I'm with, but I feel where you're coming from, but it can't just be empty rhetoric. And so SCLC and Dr. King are figuring out, okay, we've navigated the South. We've got some outcomes that we wanted. We understand that the North is having a problem as well. Let's see where we can go, and let's find a way to see if this thing can work up there and drive some of these situations that they have up there with some of the tactics we use. Also, during the time in Selma 2 weeks ago, we talked about how Malcolm X came down there at the call of SNCC and got a chance to talk with Sister Betty Shabazz. That's his wife, Miss Coretta Scott King, about ways to maybe work together to move their cause forward. Right after that, Malcolm X was murdered. assassinated, but the seeds were planted. And then with Stokely Carmichael providing the Black Power rhetoric to Dr. King for, the whole march and just the time after, Dr. King, who was, who got tuned into, and we didn't talk about this earlier, the nonviolent movement was pitched and, how can I say this and be respectful and be honest about it? It was pitched and set in front of him by Bayard Rustin, who was a founder of CORE, who organized the March on Washington. Dr. King wasn't always as moderate as we may think. And I'll leave for the next class to talk more about Dr. King's more revolutionary side. So now we end up in Chicago, where it was the second largest city in the country at that time. And there was a lot of questions around nonviolence. Would it work in the North? Voter registration, direct action, the end of slums, and housing and educational opportunities. Now, Chicago and its establishment was very, very, very weary of Dr. King coming there. So, you have a lot of dynamics here. You got these Southern preachers coming up north that had a lot to say about it socially, economically, regionally. Y'all down there in Memphis, y'all down there in Jackson, in Albany, Georgia, y'all down in North Carolina, you're down in New Orleans, you're down in Texas. That's something else. You're coming up north, that's something totally different. So now you're even dealing with, how do Northerners perceive the South? Especially Southern ministers coming up in this thing. But the funny part about it is, just a little more context, these ministers were probably trained like Dr. King in Boston, in New York, in DC. So they had some seeds of being in the North, just their work was down south. And so the city was cautious because, and Dr. King and them was out of their territory politically, culturally, and in their philosophy. And there was a big player, Mayor Daley. Mayor Daley was a big time, strong arm mayor, loved in the city by, residents, had a big hold in the Democratic Party. So he was a big dog. He was bigger. I'll say this. They were used to dealing with the Southern de facto leaders, and now you're going to get up north and deal with some people who know how to wheel and deal with you. This is where the mob was. This is where money moved, where skyscrapers are. This is a different kind of a thing happening here, and they knew how to. We'll see if they did, but on perception, they knew how to deal with these things. These were city slickers from the big city. So all these things kind of go into the story. So January 1966, the Chicago Freedom Movement was born, and their initial take was a war on slums. Slums were, you live in a ghetto community in these apartment buildings where they don't fix anything, and the alleys are full of trash and piss in the hallways and all this crazy stuff. What was interesting was this is another kind of victim, and I'll say victim, but another situation where the Great Migration. Remember, Chicago was one of the first places that we came from the South, headed straight from the Pullman porters helping us get up here, straight from the South to Chicago. And Chicago was a place where we were able to, when I say we, our culture, our people, we were able to get some roots. There were political victories. You had the first Black congressman out of Chicago. By virtue of some of the redlining and by virtue of some of the work, the blues, we brought the blues up north with us. We were able to have, the Chicago Defender and the other Black papers there, the Negro Leagues. And that's something I really didn't do a great job of, and I'm going to do in our special Black Music Month. And I'll talk about that later. Talk more about the culture that went with some of these economics and politics and civil rights. There was more than just the marches and the protests. It was the music that we made and that we propagated, baseball and how we navigated it, the press and how we navigated, clothes and fashion and style, and all these things we brought with us from down south to our cousins, another reference to sinners, up north. So this movement I was talking about, some of the sports stars, we didn't talk about Bill Russell. We hadn't talked about Jim Brown. We haven't talked about Ali, and we'll get to him a little bit. We haven't talked about all the culture that was being exchanged from the South to the North, all of the other things outside of just the civil rights. So for Black Music Month, I'm going to be doing a cultural side of civil rights, where we talk about the music of the 50s and the 60s. We talk about our culture of the 50s and the 60s and how we navigated 50s and 60s as well. Not just We Shall Overcome, though we did do that. We'll be putting a little more in that, but I'll talk about that more as we get to the end of this discussion. So the war on slums was the target for Dr. King and them. So, what would basically happen is, our people, and this is more on the Great Migration, just like I talked about in Los Angeles, our people would come from down south and our people would come up north. And when we came up north, we would come to places where we could live. But anytime you would come up north to find somewhere to live, one of two things happened. One, you had the landlords who was about that bread and said, hey, you come live here. I don't care. I want your money. I'm going to charge you rent. I'm going to charge you all this stuff. You can come live here. I don't care. That was a half of it. Then the other half of it was, as soon as the first black face popped up, them folks left to go further out to be away from these folks. And so you had that dynamic happening. So places that were white kind of enclaves turned to be black enclaves. And when these black enclaves became black enclaves, you had the landlord saying, well, since they here, I ain't got to do this. I ain't got to do that. I ain't got to, but I can charge them as much as I want to. So that kind of thing is happening. So that's how slums were put together. So not SCLC, the Chicago Freedom Movement organized rent strikes to say, all right, well, let me take a step back. I'm moving fast because I looked at the clock. So the same way people were organizing people in Mississippi and in Alabama to register to vote and to do those things, people were afraid because of what could happen. Fast forward to now, you in Chicago. Hey man, Miss Johnson, I'm from Chicago Freedom Movement. We working with Dr. King and we want to do this, we want to do that. You got people just as scared. Well, if I hold my rent, the rent man gonna kick me out. You know what I'm saying? Landlord gonna kick me out. What I'm gonna do? If I talk against what he's not doing, he gonna kick me out. What am I gonna do? And so you face the same thing as they were saying in Mississippi. What I'm gonna do if I register to vote? Mr. Charlie gonna understand it. He's gonna take my job away. So you had that same kind of thing happening. So they're trying to organize. They're trying to move in the south, in the north, using some of these tactics, working with local arms. But one thing that came up, well, I'll get to that. And so they're trying to do this rent strike. You're trying to keep it moving. Come July, you got them there for 6 months and no real victories. Because like I said, you're dealing with these city slicker mayors now. So when Dr. King and them would say, well, it's a problem over here. This ain't happening. Mayor Daley would say, okay, I'm sending out public services. We're cleaning out the mess. They're going to make sure the landlords do the repairs. Told you we didn't do it. We don't need you here, Dr. King. We got it handled. It's good. Okay, well, we'll show you something else. We're over here. This ain't happening and that ain't happening. Mayor Daley be like, okay, I'm sending city services over there. We cleaned up them parks, got them basketball courts remodeled. We made sure everything was good. We talked with the Tenants Association and everything is just fine. We don't need you, Dr. King. And so after a while, they sitting around like, sure, yeah, they on us like that. So they called for a big rally and march at Soldier Field, or no, Chicago Stadium. No, where did the Cubs play? Where did the Cubs play? Let me see, where was it? I'm moving a little fast. At Soldier Field, 5,000 people marched and they had a list of demands. Mayor Daley was like, well, everything you asked for, we doing. So why you riling our people? Why you riling our Negroes up? We heard that before, right? Why you riling our people up? We handle it. It's good. We know the leaders around here. We don't need you, Dr. King. You just bringing the spotlight and we handling it. And so the first kind of push here is in July. And then if you had the outline, I put hotter than July. Sentiment, two things. One, that was a Stevie Wonder album. And then two, we get into the heat of July in Chicago. And so the community was out just doing how they do, turned on the hydrants because it's a hot day to get a little, have like the sprinklers. And the officers came and they turned them off and kind of pushing, inciting some things to happen. The freedom movement are trying to diffuse the community to keep this thing nonviolent. But as we talked about, we're seeing cities around the country go up in riots and in flames. We're hearing Black Power, which isn't necessarily, I want to keep saying that, isn't necessarily saying light it up, but because it wasn't as defined as people needed it at that point, Black Power was, we just doing what we got to do at this point. So that, that's how it was perceived. When it really was political autonomy, economic autonomy, community autonomy, and a way to self-determine our way through. So you're having this movement happen and people saying we sick and tired. So to make a long story short, cops in the community get into an altercation, but the I keep saying SCLC because it was a lot of Dr. King's people. But the Chicago Freedom Movement we're able to keep it nonviolent, but it's starting to bubble because just earlier that year in the Puerto Rican community, a cop killed a man in the Puerto Rican community in 1966. In Chicago had a uprising. So people are really getting, like I said, the tensions are pulling here. And so the freedom movement was able to keep things together, but you started to see things start to unravel. So after 6 months, and the Chicago Freedom Movement under Dr. King's leadership isn't really getting any headway. So they said, let's change our target a little bit. Let's change this target up. And so we changed the target. So the target goes from just looking at slums and the ghetto community to looking at redlining. So this is kind of where the rubber hits the road here. So redlining and a great, let me take a step back. Ta-Nehisi Coates, Howard graduate, HU, you know, he wrote a really good piece, A Case for Reparations, in maybe 2013, 14, 12, may have been 13, 14. And he talked about redlining in Chicago. This was, so go look at that, A Case for Reparations by Ta-Nehisi Coates. It's a really good read. I believe it was in the Atlantic or the New Yorker. I read it years ago. It's a nice little read, but it's a really good piece, and it'll give you a little more insight on why he was heralded as the scholar that he is, outside of just being from HU. Really good read. But it ties into this because so redlining happened to where they say, okay, y'all can come up here, but it's de jure segregation. You know, not to cross certain lines. Down south it was, boy, you don't do this or you don't do that, and here's a sign to show you don't do it. Up north it was more subtle. You can go on 8th Street, but 9th Street you don't end up on 9th Street. You know better than that. You don't come on 9th. You know, you don't do that. Is it any statute to say that? No, we don't say that, but you know not to come on 9th because you know what's going to happen over there. So you get to this point, and they said, okay, well, we're going to change our target from looking at how bad the slums are to talking about redlining. Now, this made the issue a lot more nuanced because redlining was a social, well, let me start right. Redlining was an economic act first. First time you see somebody of a different color in a neighborhood, it drives down the property value. So people don't want the neighborhoods integrated because they want their property value. If you're a homeowner, you understand the importance of property value. So this is an economic thing. It's also a social construct to where you say, well, I don't want to be living close to them. No way. I don't want them close to me anyway. And so and then it's political to where we can keep people where they should be by just de jure. And so now you're not just talking about, you know, these slum landlords and the city officials. Now you're bringing in the realtors associations, the banks, big money. You're starting to bring all of these things into play in a city like Chicago. And so they said, all right, you know, we want to deal with this issue of redlining. And so now we start down this road of dealing with the issue of redlining. And so now you can kind of go back to some of the tactics you used in Birmingham and Jackson and Selma, because now you're dealing with a white population who could potentially be triggered by you going over there, somebody knocking you over the head or filling up jails, and you get the national media on your side, and you do what civil rights does. So they're like, okay, let's get this rolling. We're gonna do what we do best. It's like seeing Steph Curry coming off a screen and hitting a three. But as we saw this year and last year and the year before, now when Steph come off them screens, one, Klay Thompson ain't there. And even if they go in, it ain't looking like it used to back in 14, 15, 18, 19, 21. It's looking different. So will it be the same for the freedom movement? Let's look and figure it out. And so one tactic that they would use was, and Dr. King talks about this in his, and I'll play it. I won't play that clip, but I'll talk about it. I'll play a different clip. He'll talk about, okay, because we have such a unique perspective here, we'll send in our Black contingent in to look for some homes. Hey, we're a family, send a mother or a family in there. Hey, I'm a family. We're looking for some housing. What you got? We don't got nothing over here, but in the ghetto slums here, we got this, and that. Okay, well, I'll send in some of my white contingent. Hey, me and my family, we're looking for a place to live. Oh, I got something here, there, and everywhere you want to look. So they went in and did their research first. And then they said, okay, now that we got this, let's do our next step. Let's do this march. And so they said, okay, we're going to march into, one of these neighborhoods we're not supposed to be in. And as we do this march, we're going to, go. Nature will take its course, and then they will do what they do, and we'll have our nation on our side, and we'll get some difference. And so now we're in April of 1966. The mayor sent 1,200 officers to watch what was going on, but now you have a mob of 5,000. So back in Mississippi, in Jackson, or in Selma, or Montgomery, somewhere like that, you're not talking about populations this big. So they get out there, the freedom movement, and they see, instead of seeing 500, 100 people, they seeing 5,000 people. And to make a long story short, they're going to do this march. And they were saying, man, this was more intimidating and scary and rambunctious than we ever seen down south. We ain't used to seeing these kind of numbers. You forget that cities like LA, New York, Chicago, DC, that's not Selma, that's not Montgomery, that's not Greensboro, that's not Jackson. This is something different you're dealing with. And so the freedom movement remained nonviolent as the mob attacked. I forgot you looping in Jesse Jackson now. So Jesse Jackson from Chicago is in there. And so you have this march. The march happens. Dr. King get hit over his head with a brick. But then you also notice that the nation is kind of sick of this now. So where they go to the press, and the press is like, you still doing this? You're agitating? You're doing this up north now? It was different when it was down south. The New York Times and the Detroit Free Press and all these, they'll report on it when you're down south. But now you up north, that's something different. And so, we did the march. We did what we planned on doing, but we didn't get the response that we wanted to get. So first we couldn't get it because Mayor Daley beat us to the punch. Now we can't get it when we do our normal tactic. And now the community's like, all right, bro, we want to do more than this. We ain't just waiting for you to be doing this stuff that you was doing down there. Let's do something. Let's crank it up. And so Dr. King is like, well, we still want these. We still want to get some solutions done. Don't get it twisted, because that's still how the SCLC won, is by getting legal action happening. And so, after that march, it didn't turn out the way you wanted it in the press. Jesse Jackson said, to hell with it. I'm calling for my own march. I'm going to Cicero. And Cicero was a suburb of Chicago that was very, very segregated. You can work here, but you can't live here. And once you work here, you go to work and you get your ass the fuck up out of here. Excuse my French. This is coming from them. And you go back to your side of town. Jesse Jackson, being from that area, said, this is where we're going. We're taking them there. And so we're starting to see a fragmentation in the movement where they're saying, hey, this ain't what we ain't say this. We ain't say we want to do all that now. And so Jesse Jackson is saying, we calling for our own march. We going there. Tough side of town. 1,500 blacks worked on that side of town, but they didn't live there. And so you knew you worked over there. So you had some communication with these folks. You worked with them. You may have dealt with them during the day, but at night you didn't. Basically, both sides, it was a fear for a racial explosion. So everybody, the city included, Dr. King and them included, outside of the residents, they didn't want to see this happen. Residents and people was tired. Remember, I telling you, people was getting tired. So they wanted some action. Let me take a step back. I almost went too far. The folks down south wanted to see action too, but they were committed to the nonviolent perspective. They were committed to the discipline that comes with following the Lord's call and using nonviolence and using that action as a way of discipline to get what you want. Now in Chicago, they still believe in them things, but remember the nation was big there. Garvey was big there at his time. This is pre-Panthers. We're talking about the place where Fred Hampton organized. You know what I'm saying? And then we're going to get to Fred Hampton later. So Chicago was ready for it. And when I'll say this, the difference between the North and the South, and this, you saw this out West in Watts too. And then let me take a step back. In Birmingham, we looked at as well. It went up. It was a riot, and they fought too. In Mississippi, they fought too. So let me give my Southern brothers and sisters they grace too. So let me not just say up North, but for the purposes of what we're talking about, up north, they was ready. You know, you lived among these people, you worked among these people. It wasn't necessarily the same dynamic as it was down south. So, you know, they was ready to get it popping. So everybody wanted to get an opportunity out. And I want to play this clip for you here real quick of Dr. King, to kind of bring the sentiment of how he was feeling at this time. You know what I'm saying? And this is eye-opening for not only where he'll stand in this conversation, but where he'll stand forward in his time left. 1966. Now we know April 1968 he eventually gets assassinated. So let me play this and then we'll get back to what's going on in Chicago. And look at Dr. King. Look at his eyes. Look at what he's saying. This is right before we get to the Cicero March. Look at what he's saying. Look at how he's feeling. And we've been with him this whole time. So let's take a look at what Dr. King got to say about where he is and how his feelings are in the movement right now.
I'm tired of marching. Tired of marching for something that should have been mine at birth. I don't mind saying to you tonight. I don't mind saying to you tonight that I'm tired of the tension surrounding our days. I don't mind saying to you tonight that I'm tired of living every day under the threat of death. I have no martyr complex. I want to live as long as anybody in this building tonight. And sometimes I begin to doubt whether I'm going to make it through. I must confess I'm tired.
So you have Dr. King in a place where I've been doing this since 1955, bro. I know the evils. I know this. I know it. And I'm tired. Not in the sense of I'm about to quit and run and I'm done with this, but like, damn, man, like, golly, you know what I'm saying? Like, how much longer do we have to do this? How much longer do I have to be steadfast? How much longer until things change? I'm tired of having to do it. Not I'm not going to do it, but of having to do this. And if you looked at that brother's eyes, that brother was tired. You know, that brother was tired. And not even tired. Tired. T-I-D-E. The brother was tired. Hey, what's up? What's up for the wave? What up, dope? And so now you got a situation where Dr. King and his contingent are saying, and don't take that out of context. I showed that to show we're trying things, we're doing things, we've got laws passed, we got things done. We up here up north. I brought my family up here. It don't seem like it ain't getting no better. Is my living in vain? Is this working? These people is counting on me. I don't want to get it popping. I see Black Power on the horizon. I might have feel that way too, but I don't want to. I got a reputation to maintain. I don't want to look crazy out here. I want my people to get freedom. So you starting to get the situation where I'm just trying to keep this going as much as I can. And now you got one segment of the population saying, hey man, let's get it popping. It's power. We want it to get happen. Politics and the law saying, we don't need you. We don't have to do all that. And then people saying, look, man, it's another loss for Dr. King. What's going on? So he like, bruh, what we gonna do? What we doing? Check out the speech the day before his. Yep, absolutely. Yep. And we'll get to that one in 2 weeks. Yep. The mountaintop. And I'm going to take that and we're going to do a breakdown of that speech because it was so much in there about what's to come. So I'll say this, so I'm glad I got a little interaction. So, you know, and I'm not likening the two. So don't think I'm saying these are the same. But if you look at I'll say this, and I'm saying it in a tongue-in-cheek way. One is these are different situations, but just follow me here. The kind of notion that Moses gave the children of Israel when he knew he was on his way out of there, the couple, times that he'd sat down and talked to them, that's similar to what Dr. King was saying in some of those final speeches, like, look out for this. This could happen. This is happening. I'll lead y'all on and head on into the promised land, and I'm going to go without you. So it's interesting, those kind of notions between two great leaders and the kind of words they had for their people as they knew they weren't going forward. So that's a really good point. So here we go back into Chicago and Dr. King. Let me see here. Let me get this off my screen. There. So now we're at a point where Dr. King and them, people would call it concessions. They figured out that it wasn't working. Their plight into the North wasn't as prosperous as they hoped. But they were able to get Mayor Daley to kind of fix some things along the way. And so on August 66, they signed a 10-point agreement between the banks and the realtors to, chill on the red line and let people go where they go. And King agreed to stop the marches if we got some concessions and some negotiations that we'll have moving forward. Their plan wasn't to totally leave the North, but it was to get the wins we can get now, and let's kind of move forward. Now, if you go back all the way to the Albany movement, we were talking 1960, maybe 61, where SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, always said, look, this can't be a march. This can't be a movement based on charismatic leadership of the SCLC and Dr. King. We have to organize. We have to take the lead. No. We have to follow the lead of the local organizations that are doing the organizing and embolden them to continue their work and give them our resources, be it our strategies, our tactics, our resources to help them. So when Dr. King leave or when we leave, they still can do the work. In Albany, they said that. When they got to Mississippi when they got to Alabama for the Selma March, they were saying the same things. And SCLC was like, yeah, you're right, but we got Dr. King, and he'll bring the press, he'll bring the media, he'll bring people out, and we ain't got to worry about all that. And so you're starting to see it come to a head now, where SNCC is, still keeping their heads in everything. It's the students saying you gotta organize the people. So when Dr. King leave, you still have to have a movement of people who got the strategies and tactics and are emboldened because this is their community. They got to be able to do it. And so now you got a situation where Dr. King and them got what they could get out of the government, and they left headed towards the next spot where they were going to fight. And then you had the people saying, hold up, bro, this ain't what we ain't asked for you to come. We don't need you to come. No disrespect to Dr. King, of course, but they're saying we live here, we work here, we're going to be here. We was here before you, and we're going to be here after you. And, we ain't happy with what you signed, and we still keeping that Cicero march. Now they was able to get Jesse Jackson to say, okay, I'm out of here too. I'm not going to do it. I'm going with Dr. King and I'm out. But you had the people, and we call them the West Side organization, said, we still going into Cicero because we still, we know this, we live this. And so they went into Cicero and said, this is no Dr. King march, no Dr. King, no Jesse Jackson. This is us, and we doing it. And so, Mayor Daley sent 3,000 law enforcement troops. And it was a people's march to where we ain't say we doing it nonviolent. You throw something my way, we throwing it back. You do something to me, we doing it to you. But they did have cover. You throw rocks, we gonna throw rocks. You throw bricks, we gonna throw bricks. This is the place Fred Hampton organized. Don't get it twisted. You know what I'm saying? We'll get to that in a minute. And so, Dr. King and them left out of Chicago, having made an impact, but not as much as they wanted to. Having, the mayor had to go and clean up some of them slums and clean up some of them parks and make sure rent was decent and made sure. So some things did happen there. But when they looked for the national outcry like they would typically get, the national outcry wasn't there. The press wasn't following them. So they couldn't get what they wanted. And so the march continued, and let's take a look into that march. This wasn't a Dr. King march. This wasn't an SCLC march. This wasn't a SNCC march. This was the people of the West Side of Chicago. Shout out to the West Side and the South Side, the old school West Side and South Side, and how they wanted to move. So I'm gonna get this up, and then we'll go into that conversation. Let's see. I lived in Akron, Ohio, 45 minutes from Cleveland. Dr. King boycotted the supermarkets. Yep, 67. Yep, that's right. All right, so let me drop this on you real quick, and we'll talk about this. Where was it in the thing? Was it 30:52? Okay, it's only about 3 minutes here, and you can see the tenor between this march and some of the marches that the Dr. King and them was in on. So let me share the screen here.
With some hard answers for us, with some
Let me get the full screen. Give me a second.
And some people we can hold responsible to, and some time frames. but none of this was there.
Local groups announced their own march into Cicero. It would take place without Jesse Jackson or Dr. King.
We are not marching into Cicero to appeal to the white conscience, but to demonstrate to everybody that rank and file people now are a new breed, a new kind of cat. Without fear, we do not come hat in hand, scratching our heads, shuffling our feet to beg for a few concessions. In this march, we are serving notice. Beginning today, every Negro conceives, acts, and live out the assumption that he can walk anywhere, that he is a human like anybody and is to be treated like anybody else.
The day that the march took place, Dr. King called me at home, and he said to me, you know, Bob, we would like to save Cicero to use it, you know, later on for something, and that I wish that you know, wouldn't go. And I told Dr. King, I said, well, Doc, that, you know, my conscience, you know, dictates to me that I must lead the march into Cicero.
We got there, and it was such few, we became a little frightened. And we kept standing around, and finally it was 12 o'clock. I believe it was 12 o'clock. And all of a sudden, guys start getting out of cars, and people start coming out of doorways, and they said, okay, Lucas, step off time.
About 250 marchers began walking into Cicero. Over 3,000 law enforcement agents were on hand.
Let's keep coming, don't stop. You fat punk, I see what you made out of. You fat punk, and your mama do.
Well, it was not a King march. You know, we just went out there on faith. We just went, look at people. And that was the difference. It was a groundswell of grassroots people. And when they threw bricks, they got them back. We caught them and we threw them back. So it was give and take in Cicero for over a mile or so. And I'll never forget it.
As the marchers left Cicero, little had been resolved. The Southern civil rights victories had not been repeated in the North. The problems and the anger remained. The tension building between Black and white America would explode with greatest force in Detroit, Michigan.
Hold up, they're getting to something I ain't ready for yet. Yeah, so to put a bow on Chicago, I think it was another situation where one, we got a chance to see that the North was a, you know, they would say this in sports. Kobe said this on a commercial talking to Kanye West. Say what you want to say. I ain't defending either of them. Are you the same animal but a different beast? And that just means basically, you know, are you able to take things to another level when you need to? Dr. King and his movement really took things to one level from 55 to about 64. Or the passing of the Voting Rights Act 65, let's say. But after that, you know, things changed. And what nonviolent direct action and those principles that we're so good with, they weren't as useful from a media perspective, from a people perspective, from a tactical perspective. It just wasn't the same. The times called for a different thing. And, you know, one of the greatest, I'll say this just as somebody who was a, you know, African American studies major, somebody who studied this my whole life, somebody who's looking at it in hindsight. One of the greatest tragedies outside of, you know, the many people murdered, the many people who had to give their life, the many people who had to get lynched, the many people outside of all of that, was that the next part of the movement needed a thought leader like Brother Malcolm, and he got assassinated. And we'll talk about COINTELPRO in the next class. And so as we start to move to Black Power, you got Kwame Ture, Stokely Carmichael, you got Dr. Huey P. Newton and his philosophy with the Panthers, Bobby Seale. But you're missing that kind of mentor for the movement that they needed in Black Power. We're seeing that now power is what people want. Power is what people need. And some of those things that were so useful in getting us from the we shall overcome or freedom now era aren't as useful or aren't as tactical as the government changes, as people change, and as the time changes. So you're starting to get this thing moving forward. This brings us to, let me turn my hat so you can see. I wear this every time I wear it. That's where I live. Where my daddy lived, and this is the place that is my home now. We're going to take it to Detroit, 1967. And one thing that I may have said earlier in the conversation, and I want to provide an apology, and I won't make that distinction again. When we were going up, these were uprisings. I don't want to call them riots. These were uprisings. These were situations that happened in conjunction with other things. In 2017, I was fortunate enough to work with an organization that did a 50-year commemorative on the Detroit Uprisings. It was a book that was written called Intersection, and I'll drop the link to that in our wrap up. There was a documentary done called 12th and Claremont, and I spent an entire year doing film showings and doing interactions around the 50 years since the Detroit Uprising. So this is something that talking about this, I'm going to take my time on, and I know we might be over. So if you got to jump off, go ahead and do that. And I'll be able to provide a lot more information on the back end on this uprising. And so let's, the Motown. Yes, that's how we do. Shout out to you for the interaction. I'm loving that today. So let's jump into Motown, the 67 uprisings. So again, like we've been talking about all day, we talked about LA, we talked about Chicago, and we talked about Detroit. The Great Migration brought us north. The Great Migration brought us to jobs where Henry Ford said, "Oh, I'll pay you $5 a day." And at that time, that was crazy. And if you look at Detroit, and I still live here, it's a second home to me. Detroit was a booming. We're talking Motown, baby. We're talking about the mid 60s in Detroit. So you're talking about the auto industry booming. You're talking about, let me get my notes up here. You're talking about industry booming. You're talking about arts and culture of the urban community booming. But you're also talking about urban renewal. You're talking about blowing up Black communities and putting an expressway through it, like they did through a lot of Black cities in this country. You're talking about opportunities where you're seeing a segregation among leadership or management and labor. But you're also talking about communities where you are able to send your kids to school. You are able to work them hours, and you worked on the factory line, but your daughter or your son became a lawyer, or they became a teacher, or they became a doctor. You're talking about a place where you can find some kind of suitable living. You can find a place to live. You can find these things. There are universities. Detroit was a very interesting place, but it also was a racial line that you can't get twisted. You're talking about the place, and we'll talk about Coleman A. Young later in the next class. We talk about the Black Power class of what happened when you were able to bring people to get elected. You're talking about Charles Diggs, who was a congressman who was at the Emmett Till trial and brought national attention. So you're talking about Detroit was a place where you saw some of the highest highs. You had one of the biggest entrepreneurs in business, Berry Gordy, running a company, would be $120 million company in today's numbers. You know what I'm saying? back during that time. But you also had situation where you had these big 4 patrols where, you know, they would go in the corner and knock people's heads off for being on the corner. You had a strict line between who was and who wasn't, who should or who shouldn't. And so, you know, police brutality and economic opportunity were at the center of this one. Sound like I'm talking about Watts, right? Sound like I'm talking about Chicago, right? It sound like I'm telling the same story. But that's the irony of the North during that time. While we were making progress and We Shall Overcome did provide opportunities for us to navigate, it's still an issue that we were navigating. So to make a long story short, police and community relations were very, very low. And the uprising started with the raid of a blind pig after hour spot. So, you know, folks at an after hour spot, getting it in, enjoying their weekend like, you know, we do. And big 4 patrols roll up. In my town, if you worked at Chrysler Ford, yep, you were high class. Exactly. So there was to that point, you was doing something. You had you a nice car. You had you a nice place. Your kids were able to go to the best schools that they could at that time. You were stable. You did have some bread. So you're right about that. That was you was winning if you had a job in the big 3 during that time. Yes, you're right about that. And so you get a raid into the blind pig, where they weren't being as hospitable as you may want them to be when they're arresting folks. You know, and they started. Let me say this: have you seen the movie Harlem Nights? And I'm going to movies because I'm trying to make it relatable and easy to understand. I could take us PhD level, but I want to make it fun. I want us to understand. If you remember the movie Harlem Nights, Sugar Ray was a Richard Pryor character when he told the mob boss and the cops that he wasn't going to pay him. Cantone and all them told him wasn't going to pay him, and he still running Sugar Ray's, and they came in and they took everybody out and they took them all to jail. And they had to paddy wagon them all to jail. And later, Sugar Ray got them out, paid them the money up front and did all of that. That's kind of what happened in this situation. They was, you know, took everybody who was at the after hour spot to jail. People were seeing this, and you started to see an uprising happen. People began to throw rocks, yell stuff. And then Sunday morning, the crowd took to looting and to burning. People felt like the revolution was right around the corner because in these conversations, so in urban community, everything that was deemed un-American was seemed American for us. So during the 50s and the 40s, communist talk was big in the barber shops around equality and around how that was moving. Black power was really starting to circulate. And so you're starting to think, people were really thinking, and we'll talk about this in the next class, revolution is coming. So this is just part of revolution. When this happens, the revolution is gonna happen, and we're gonna overthrow everything, and the proletarian is gonna be, you know, this whole thing is gonna happen. So you really started to think it was gonna happen, and they were looking at this as the catalyst. So as the uprising starts, you have your more moderate Black leaders who will go on to do great things. John Conyers, who would go to be the longest serving, or one of the longest serving congressmen, who brought HR 1, the reparations bill, up every year that he was in Congress, and a legend around these parts. And Dr. Art Johnson, who was the deputy superintendent of schools, they were trying to cool it down, understanding the larger scheme of things, saying, look, man, we outnumbered, we out everything. Let's kind of cool it, and let's not blow up our side of town. Let's keep what we got, and let's show them what, you know, let's not do it that way. So the city was burning. And the government and they so the other side of the aisle felt like the city was on fire, and the work that we've been doing to stabilize and make this place what it is being undone. 12 hours after the raid started, Governor Romney called in the National Guard, which was a very unique kind of situation. So if you're bringing in the National Guard, 2 things I think is saying: 1, we can't control it, and 2, it voids the insurance claims that you want to make. So all this burning and looting and everything is happening, it's going to void out your insurance if you bring it in the National Guard. And so LBJ, which was, you know, in hindsight, you know, Kennedy got assassinated, so he paid his price, unfortunately. And then LBJ paid the price for being alive. The Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, these riots, everything was happening in his lap that shouldn't have maybe been in his lap. But God bless his heart, and I'm saying that tongue in cheek. had to deal with this as well. So dealing with everything else, he dealing with this. And so he said, okay, I'm gonna send in some troops, but let's send them in unarmed, as much as unarmed as we can. So 7,000 troops arrived, ready to go. Most of them were white, young whites, and no training and not heavily armed. At this point, you got 100 city blocks that are in turmoil and that are in play. And so you're dealing with another mass kind of situation. We're still dealing with the issues that exist. Yeah, you're right about that. How do you think they burned down the wrong? Do you think they burned down the wrong side of town? That's a good. So I'll say this: you can only burn down where you at. You know what I'm saying? So think about it like this. Yeah, we live here. This is for a lot of, so again, not in the monolith, but in the people who weren't fortunate enough to get those good jobs, because everybody didn't get a job down at the plant. Everybody ain't get a chance to own their own business. Everybody ain't get a chance to be the pastor. Everybody ain't get a chance to be the lawyer. Everybody ain't get a chance. Those were the few. Du Bois called these people the talented 10th for a reason. This is a small minority of our community that get these opportunities. And then you got people who are kind of, everyday kind of blue collar people who may get it and may not, depending on how the winds, swirl. And then you got the people on the back end who don't get nothing, who never get nothing. We still got them today. We got people in our family, everybody who don't got nothing, ain't gonna get nothing, no matter if it's Trump the president or not, no matter if Biden the president, no matter if who. It's just the people in our community, in our families, and people we know that never get nothing. So the people who are doing a lot of these tactics are the people who never get nothing, no matter what, man. No matter if it's no matter if it's a job here or not, I ain't getting it. No matter if it's a college down the street or not, I ain't gonna go there. No matter if it's so people who just the have-nots who society ensures that there will always be. Those are the people who are saying, you know what, bump it, light this mug up, burn, baby, burn. I came in there, listen, I had a brand new watch, got for my birthday. I needed some money. I went down to your pawn shop, and it was worth $50. You said you'd give me 2 for it. And I took the 2 because I needed it, but you did bad business with me. You know what I'm saying? Or I come in here to buy my favorite beverage, and you treat me like I'm a criminal. You know I'm on here. I'm here all the time. Or, we saw in the 90s, no for you. You got to get out of here. So those were the people saying, bumping, I'm putting this mug up. Without seeing that maybe we are burning the wrong side of town. Maybe we shouldn't be doing this. We got to go back here. It's where we live. It's where the business, where the barbershop is. It's where the soul food spot is. This is where our church is. But when you sick and tired, you sick and tired. It's almost like time stood still. Yeah. You're right about that. And so you get there. It was a radical rebellion. And what people were saying was, we want control of our own community, and that's basically what we're fighting for. So the feds are here now. A 9 p.m. curfew is in place, which people aren't stopping. Thousands on the streets, looting is happening, burning is happening. People are tired. So now you're starting to see an influx of murder. You're starting to see snipers, and they're starting to. So because it's such a violent time, now people who just want to do wrong things are doing them on the other side. Snipers getting on top of buildings, shooting black folks. Cops saying, I killed him because he had a gun when people ain't had no gun. Again, this is happening in a neighborhood. This ain't happening, this is happening where people live. Let's see, shooting the street lights out. So now you living in darkness, and all this crazy stuff is happening. So by Monday morning, you got hundreds of injured, people dead, they shot, people dying in fires. The situation was out of hand. So that was I messed up. That was the Michigan National Guard that came first. And so now Governor Romney is saying, LBJ, we need the federal troops. And that would void the insurance, and that would do all those things. So Roy Wilkins, who used to be the head of the NACP, is working with LBJ. And he's sending him out there to kind of handle this too. So the compromise was they send the troops out, but with no guns. 4,700 troops arrived, the same troops that arrived in Little Rock to make sure the Little Rock 9 got into school, and in Ole Miss to make sure James Meredith got into school. So if you've been with me, now you're starting to see a repeat. That's the 101st and the 82nd Airborne Division. The rioting continued into Monday night. Now you got over 3,900 people arrested. Fire crews from 35 municipalities around the city are coming to try to put some of these fires out. No end in sight. 11:20 Monday night, LBJ sent in the troops. 19 people died since that first raid at the Blind Pig. Now you got the looting is over. Usually when the federal troops get there, that's usually when stuff kind of coil down. And you got a curfew in effect. Total, you got over 17,000 law enforcement individuals from the local police, the Michigan National Guard, and the feds are there. 7,200 people arrested, most of them Black men. The jails were full, so they're starting to create these detention centers. You got fear, resentment, and confusion. Cops shooting in the buildings, just all this craziness happening. So finally, when things kind of cool down after 5 days, you got 43 people dead, 33 of them being Black, $50 million or estimated $200 million, just like Watts. The 5th year of unrest happening in cities, and over 400 families displaced. That's speaking to that they burn the right side of town. So now, first we got, and this is, I know we way over time, but first you had urban renewal kill Black communities like Black Bottom and Paradise Valley. So people moved over to this area of town. And now this area of town is burned. So now I got to find somewhere else to go. So you're seeing more and more displacement because of one government, and then now because we got sick and tired. So the aftermath is basically we're left with a situation to where now you have a situation of white flight. Those who were in Detroit at that moment went out to the suburbs and disinvestment in the city. But then you also will see as we move forward, the first Black mayor of the city of Detroit, Coleman A. Young. So that's it for that. Let me play this video and then we'll talk about kind of where we're going to move forward here. I had a different one to play, but I want to, well, for time's sake, I'll play this one. All right, let me share my screen. Oh wait, I'll put that in the wrap up. Let's see here. Share my screen and let's look at the Detroit riots, a retrospective here. Couple minutes.
The Detroit riots. In 1967, a riot broke out during a long, hot summer night in the Virginia Park neighborhood of Detroit, Michigan. Lasting more than 2 days, it was one of the most destructive riots in American history. We're going to take a look at what set the riots off, the riots themselves, and the consequences. In the late 1960s, the civil rights movement in the United States was growing stronger, but racial inequality was still a big problem. Deindustrialization of the cities and the desegregation of schools was causing a reshuffling of neighborhoods. As part of integration efforts, people of color moved into urban areas that were once predominantly white. But in response, many white people fled to the suburbs, some scared of integration, and some having lost their factory jobs. This phenomenon is called white flight and contributed to segregation. With many whites having fled urban centers, business owners and politicians neglected these new, mostly Black neighborhoods, leading to overcrowding and deterioration. While Detroit spent money on developing and racially integrating the inner city, Black residents of neighborhoods like Virginia Park were still dealing with housing and employment discrimination, poor access to medical services, an underfunded public education system, and racism from law enforcement. On July 23, 1967, at 3:15 a.m., the Vice Squad of the Detroit Police Department conducted a raid on an unlicensed bar on 12th Street in Virginia Park. Although it was late, the street was full of people trying to keep cool because of a heat wave. While the police were making arrests, a brick flew through a police car window, prompting the riots, looting, and fires that would rage for days. On July 25th, Governor George Romney called in the Michigan National Guard, and the riots finally ended on July 27th. But the damage and human loss was unprecedented. 43 people died. Over 1,000 were injured. Over 7,200 were arrested. More than 2,000 buildings and structures were damaged, and hundreds of families were left homeless. The riots accelerated the exodus of white people from the city, making segregation even worse. But it also drew attention to the problem.
President Lyndon B. Johnson appointed a commission to figure out why the riots happened. The report found that white racism, discrimination, and poverty were to blame for the riots. It warned, quote, "Our nation is moving toward two societies, one black and one white, separate and unequal." 2 years later, the Stonewall riots would occur at the Stonewall Inn in New York City, which was targeted in a raid very similar to the bar on 12th Street. Like in Detroit, the spontaneous violence at the Stonewall Inn also resulted from discrimination, but this time against the LGBT community. The Stonewall was a popular safe haven for New York.
All right, for time's sake, I'm not going to play the whole thing. But yeah, so we'll talk a lot more about, thanks for joining us. I appreciate you. We'll talk more about the Kerner Commission, which was the report that LBJ commissioned after the riots. I'm gonna save that because it was so much in it. We'll talk about that in the Black Power class. So that's kind of it on the Detroit riots. I want to talk about some next steps and what we have moving forward. So we're winding down. We're getting to the end of this thing here. Next week is week 9. Week 9, we talk about some political victory. We talk about, Carl Stokes was the first Black mayor of a major city in America, 1966, 67, I believe. And we'll talk about how that happened in Cleveland, Ohio. So we talked about Voting Rights Act and all this marching and fighting we was doing. Now we get to see some kind of victory from some of that work and how that led to some of the rest of the next Black wave of Black mayors of the early 70s. And then the final week of this course will be, I'm sorry. So we'll talk about that. And then we'll talk about the formation of the Black Panther Party. If you know me, that was always my favorite. But we'll only go from Black Panther from 66 to about 68 of their work. In 2 weeks, week 10 is the last class of the semester where we'll talk about Dr. King's final years. So his plight in Memphis, the Poor People's Campaign, the sanitation workers strike, and we'll wrap up with his assassination and the next steps of the movement as it moved forward. Now, luckily for us all, I have 2 other things coming. So June is Black History Month and Black Music Month. So after we're done with week, and I'll drop this to my, you'll see it on Facebook, you'll see it on Instagram, and you'll see it for the people signed up to my, in my listserv. We're going to do either 1 or 2 episodes on the music and culture of civil rights. So we'll be looking at 50s and 60s music, movies, fashion, culture, athletes, and just looking at all the other things to make the civil rights thing come into being, which I left out intentionally. So we're going to celebrate Black Music Month by 1 or 2. I haven't figured out. I might be able to fit it all into 1, but it may be 2. Looks at, the culture of civil rights. So not just what we did in these marches, but church and press and media and what we wore and the music and all those good things, centered heavily on the music. Motown and all that good stuff. But then next semester, and I'm still putting a date together for it. I've been doing a lot of my lit review for this class. We're going to do a Black Power class, which will either be 4 or 5 classes on civil rights, still civil rights, but Black Power from 1968, so the end of Dr. King's life, all the way until 1980, to look at what happened during Black Power and COINTELPRO and the rest of the riots that happened. What happened during Black politics with the wave of Black mayors getting elected, like Coleman Young in Detroit, Maynard Jackson in Atlanta, even all the way up into, what's my main man, Harold Washington in Chicago, Marion Barry in DC. That might be the end of the politics part right there. We'll talk about the proliferation of Black business during the 70s and up into the 80s, affirmative action 70s and 80s, up until 1980. We'll talk about the Black arts movement and how Black Power birthed another movement. We saw one in the Harlem Renaissance, but we'll look at the Black arts movement. So we're going to keep this train going, and I'll have more information and specifics on that. So be on the lookout for the culture of civil rights, which will be for Black Music Month. And then we'll start the Black Power lectures where we'll look at those things I just talked about. So again, today we talked about Watts or Up South. Civil rights as it relates to cities in the West, the Watts uprisings, Dr. King in Chicago and the Chicago Freedom Movement, and the Detroit uprising in 1967. We're really moving through this thing. We got 2 more weeks of the Power and Protest Civil Rights class, where we talk about the Panthers and Stokes and Cleveland next week. And then 2 weeks from now, we'll talk about Dr. King, and we'll end the class. And then we'll go forward in our culture of civil rights, where we look for Black Music Month. And in July, we'll be starting our Black Power class. So I appreciate your time today. A couple minutes over, but I still see we got folks here, so I'm appreciative of that. Make sure you like and you share this post in Facebook, so we can grow the reach of this course. We had a new voice in here that I'm not used to, so I'm glad that it seems like new people are getting adjusted to the class. Thanks for coming out. God bless, and enjoy your Memorial Day. One piece of homework, and I'm gonna talk about next week. Look up the link between Black folks and Memorial Day, and we'll talk about it next week. I appreciate your time. I appreciate your energy, and I'll see you next week. Peace.